Today, we begin our look at European exploration and conquest, 1450 to 1650. It is important to go ahead and define a couple of phrases that I will be using in today's discussion. You will hear me use the expression Old World. For this discussion, the Old World specifically refers to Europe. However, you will also find that the Old World, when it is defined, often includes Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. But in the parameters of our discussion, we will be using Old World to simply refer to Europe. You'll also hear me use the expression New World. New World refers to the Americas. That's with an S on the end, and it refers to North, Central, and South America. In Chapter 15, European Exploration and Conquest, 1450 to 1650, the Old World accidentally, thanks to Christopher Columbus, rediscovers the existence of the New World. More about that later. It is important to note that depending upon the textbook or scholarly source that we look into and refer to, that sometimes this period in which the Old World discovers the existence of the New World is called variously as the Age of European Expansion, or the Age of Discovery, or the Age of Reconnaissance. What I'll do is I'll tell you why each of those particular titles for this period works. Well, we can call this period the Age of Discovery because, quite simply, the Old World of Europe discovers the existence of the New World of the Americas. We can call it the Age of European Expansion because once the Old World discovers the existence of the New World, various countries in Europe quickly work to take over and colonize and expand into New World territories. In other words, Europe is interested in colonizing these various areas in the New World of the Americas, taking it over for their own benefit. We can also call this period the Age of Reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is a word that means fact-finding, and we really have to look at the voyages of all of the explorers in this time period as voyages of reconnaissance or fact-finding, literally getting out to see what the world was like, mapping and charting as they go. A little further note on calling this period the Age of Reconnaissance. The old western half of the Roman Empire fell in the year 476 AD due to barbarian or Germanic invasions. The eastern half of the Roman Empire continued for another 1,000 years to 1453 AD. As the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire. In that 1,000 years, from the fall of the western half of Rome to the start of this period, 1450 AD, that's 1,000 years, Europe had gained no more knowledge of geography and of the physical layout of the earth than had the ancient Romans. So basically, what Europe knows in 1450 about the layout of the world is what knowledge they have inherited from ancient Rome. That means in 1450, Europe knows about the existence, obviously, of Europe. That's where Europeans live, after all. They know about Africa and Asia. They do not know exact sizes and dimensions, and they certainly do not know about the existence of the New World. If we were to take a look at a world map, which you can do within chapter 15, if you look at page 496, you can see a map of the world. If you were to draw a line right down the middle and look just at the eastern half, or that would be, if you're geographically challenged, the right-hand side of the map, that would be the Old World. If you take that map and you fold it around on itself and you pretend that the Americas don't exist, then you would see the world as Europeans saw the world in the year 1450. Their concept of our planet Earth, of the world, was one that was inaccurate and much smaller than it actually is. They believed that Europe was separated from Asia by a small body of water. So this literally is a period of reconnaissance or fact-finding, because in this period, explorers from Europe will make massive contributions to geographical knowledge. So our focus in Chapter 15, let me say again, is expansionism, imperialism, and colonialism. All three of those words mean the same thing. Europe discovers the existence of the New World and then is eager to expand their holdings, their territories in the New World. So let us start today actually before 1450, when one hears that the age of European expansion began in 1450 and lasted until 1650, we might wrongly assume that Europe only expanded in that 200-year time period, and that would be an inaccurate assumption. Before 1450, Europe had attempted at least twice to expand and get bigger. And the first one that I'll tell you about, their first attempt is actually circa or around about 900 to 1000 AD. A group of people from Scandinavia, that is Northern Europe, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, people from Scandinavia called Vikings, were led by men such as Eric the Red and Leif Erikson to get out and to explore. Now initially, Vikings explored due south of Scandinavia, or they left from Northern Europe and sailed into and around Europe, and of course discovered that it was inhabited. Obviously, between 900 and 1000 there are countries in Europe, France, the Holy Roman Empire, etc. So with those areas being inhabited, the Vikings took to raping and pillaging and demanding tribute. That grew boring after a while, and some Viking had the notion, possibly Eric the Red or Leif Erikson, to take the Vikings in a different direction altogether, and that was west across a body of water that we would recognize today as the Atlantic Ocean. And as the Vikings went westward, they chartered and settled in previously uninhabited, undiscovered areas like Greenland and Iceland. They went even farther west after that and ended up in the New World. They actually ended up in parts of Canada and as far south as the state of Maine in the modern United States of America. The Vikings attempted to make permanent settlements here. They sent for more Vikings to join them for maybe as long as 100+ years or so. There were Viking settlements in the New World. But those Viking settlements disappeared, and where they went, we don't know. That still remains a subject of debate among historians to this very day. What we do know is that the Vikings failed to write down their adventures, their settlements, their exploits in the New World. The Vikings had a tendency to share their history orally, passing it down from generation to generation through stories that rhymed and were sung, and those were called sagas. Well, by the time of Christopher Columbus in 1492 AD, the Vikings and their voyages to the Americas had already been forgotten about because the Vikings failed to write down that information. In other words, Christopher Columbus was not, in fact, the first European in the New World. That honor goes to the Vikings, and we have known that from archaeological evidence definitively for certain that the Vikings were the first Europeans here since the 1960s. However, it does require us to say here at this point that the Americas had been inhabited since about 13,000 BC, give or take 1,000 years, by people who had crossed from Asia across the land bridge, across the Bering Strait, down into Alaska, and populated North, Central, and South America from there. So certainly the Vikings were not first in the Americas. First in the Americas were Native Americans, or as Europeans after the Vikings would call them, Indians. A second attempt by Europe to expand before 1450 was in the Crusades. Now, this is the stuff of Western civilization 1, so we won't get long and drawn out in this, but just a quick review. From 1096 until 1270 AD, Christian crusaders from Europe were involved in a series of Christian holy wars against the Muslim infidels, they called them, for the holy city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you may not know, is a holy city to both Christians and Muslims, and of course to Jews as well. But to Christians, this of course was the city in which Jesus lived, was crucified, in which he died. To the Muslims, it is the death place of their prophet Muhammad. So this was a hotly contested city. Christians could not stand the idea of Muslims holding on to that city. Muslims didn't want Christians in Jerusalem. So in 1096, this exploded into what was called the period of the Crusades, from 1096 to 1270. In that time period, there were 8 crusades. At the start of every crusade, Jerusalem belongs to the Muslims. At the end of every crusade, the Christians have it again. And then they lose it to the Muslims, and Jerusalem goes back and forth, switching hands for 8 crusades from 1096 to 1270. What Christians had hoped to do as a result of the crusades was largely gain the city of Jerusalem, but a second reason behind the crusades was to gain land and to expand Christian control into the Middle East. So as a result of the Crusades from 1096 to 1270, Europe did gain off and on control over Jerusalem and some of its surrounding areas, and areas that were on the way to Jerusalem. Places today that would be in modern-day Lebanon, for example, Syria and Jordan. Places like Edessa, Tripoli, and Antioch were captured by the Christians. But by 1270, it was pretty obvious to Christian crusaders that their armies were growing weaker while the Muslims were growing stronger. And by 1270, it was plainly obvious to Christian crusaders that they had to give up on the idea of having Jerusalem or any territories in the Middle East because of the strength of the military of these various Muslim groups. So the Crusades were a loss for Europe. For the short term of the Crusades, they gained land, but they were forced, because of the growing power of the Muslims, to give up their dreams of having territory in the East, specifically the Middle East. And by 1453, one group of Muslims had grown very powerful. They were called the Ottoman Turks. They came out of Turkey and in 1453 captured the Byzantine Empire, the last vestiges of the old Roman Empire. They took control of it, including its capital city of Constantinople. They moved quickly from there to gain control over the whole Middle East and Northern Africa. In 1453, Constantinople, that's the capital city of the Byzantine Empire, fell to the Turks. This is an important date, 1453, in our discussion of chapter 15. Really, we should say that the age of European exploration and conquest, or the age of European expansion, begins precisely in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. Constantinople, if you take a look at the map in your text on page 496, was geographically centered, basically, between the trade routes from Europe to Asia. And since the 300s AD, when Constantinople had been founded, this city was an important center of trade between Europe and Asia. Europe was gaining wonderful commodities, things that they desired from Asia here, things like spices to flavor their food, which was bland and or slightly rotten because of lack of preservation techniques of food. True, it was salted, but it didn't always work. So they got spices, things like gold and ivory, and they were even trading for slaves from Russia in the city of Constantinople. Actually, the word slave comes from Slavs, or Slavic peoples, the people who lived in Russia who were the first slaves of Europe. So in 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Turks more or less made an ultimatum to Christian Europe. We don't like you because we're Muslim and you're Christian. We just fought you in the Crusades. If you want these wonderful commodities that you're used to getting here in Constantinople, you'll have to pay us for these things, whatever price we require, or you'll have to find some other way to get the materials and items that you want from Asia. Europe weighed those options, decided that they did not want to pay Muslim middlemen extremely high prices for these commodities through Constantinople. They certainly could not go overland to get to Asia, since the Muslims were in the way. They controlled all of the Middle East and Africa. They couldn't go over land, so what to do? Go by water. So the age of European expansion begins because of the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Turks. Europe's desire for commodities from Asia leads them to look for a water route to Asia. Now, obviously, if you're looking in your textbook on page 496 at the map, you can see that what they're going to have to do to get to Asia is to sail from Europe all the way down around Africa and cut up across the Indian Ocean and get over to India and other parts of Asia for the goods and commodities that they desire. This is not a short trip. They don't know how big Africa is, exactly its shape, how long it's going to take. So which country steps in here and decides to be the leader, the trailblazer, let's get out and find this route to Asia? That country is Portugal. In particular, one man, Prince Henry the Navigator, born in 1394, dead in 1460. Let's start with what sounds like useless information first. But Prince Henry was a younger son of the King of Portugal, which meant he would never rule Portugal as king. He knew this. His father, the King of Portugal, knew this about his youngest son. Prince Henry had to find something else to do with himself. So, fortunately, he had a great love, and that was the sea. He used his allowance, the money he was given from his dad, to found a school for sailors who would get out and search for a water route to Asia. This is why Prince Henry is known as the Navigator. He set up a school in which he taught sailors the latest technological tools and advancements in sailing for the time. These included things like caravel ships, magnetic compass, astrolabe. He taught sailors how to use magnetic compass to find their direction, how to use an astrolabe to find direction, which you can read about these inside your textbook within chapter 15. He also taught his sailors how to look for clues when at sea about how to find land. This was a practice called dead reckoning. Basically, it's just guessing. Do the best you can when you're at sea. If you see vegetation, try to follow the vegetation, determine where that's coming from. Obviously, it's coming from land. If you see birds flying overhead, alter your course to follow them. Birds don't live at the sea. They live on land. Follow them. So more or less, he's teaching these sailors how to guess about where they're going. He also builds a new style ship at his school called a caravel. It replaces the old oar-powered galleys or galleons. The caravel is a small, light, easy-to-maneuver ship that has sails. It's wind-powered instead of man-powered. It's a great technological advance because a caravel no longer requires manpower. Using oarsmen is a complicated process because first you have to find them. And in this period, with the Black Death popping up repeatedly, we've got a shortage of manpower, of labor. So we replaced manpower and oarsmen with sails. It's also difficult to maneuver a ship that is powered by oarsmen because your oarsmen have to be in perfect harmony and synchronicity in their movements or the ship doesn't steer or turn properly. Not a problem with a caravel ship. Also, since we take out all of the men inside the ship, that frees up the inside of the ship to store all of the great stuff that you're out looking for anyway, like spices and gold. Okay, so what is also important about Prince Henry the Navigator is that he uses his money not only to set up this school and train sailors, but every year he would fund a voyage of exploration. He would send his sailors, after they were trained how to use a compass, an astrolabe, and a caravel ship, and dead reckoning, he would send them out to explore along the northern coast and western coast of Africa, looking for an opening to Asia. Obviously, referring back to the map in your textbook, there is no opening at the top or on the very top western side of Africa. So Prince Henry is not significant for finding the water route to Asia. What he is significant for is starting a trend which will be carried on by kings of Portugal. For example, King John II reigns as the King of Portugal from 1481 until 1495. King John II funded many voyages of exploration along the coastline of Africa looking for a way to get to Asia, but the most significant voyage that he funds is that of Bartholomew Diaz, which can be spelled with a Z or an S at the end. Diaz lived somewhere between 1450 and 1500. He took a voyage from 1487 through 1488 from Portugal down the entire western coast of Africa, mapping and charting as he went along. He and his men kept pushing themselves to go farther and farther. You have to remember, no one's done this yet, so this is a major undertaking, takes a great deal of bravery. When Diaz and his men got near the very southernmost tip of Africa, they lost sight of land for nearly 3 months, and they were tossed about in horrible storms. When the storms subsided after about 100 days or 3 months, Diaz and his men see the tip of Africa. They land on it, they rest up, they take provisions, they head back to Portugal, desperate to get back home. When they arrive at the court of King John II, Diaz and his men recount their experiences on this long voyage, the longest that has been undertaken yet. John II is impressed by the maps and charts of Diaz and his work. He says, "This is awesome, it's great. I'll let you name that southernmost point that you went to. What would you like to call it?" He says, "I want to call it the Cape of Storms because that's an accurate description of what I experienced." King John II says, and that is exactly why we won't call it that. It's a propaganda move here. If you call this area Cape of Storms, that's going to more or less make other men think twice about going on a voyage like this. It would be scary. So instead, he calls it the Cape of Good Hope, and that area in Africa is still known as the Cape of Good Hope to this very day. King John II was followed by King Manuel I as the King of Portugal. Manuel funds many voyages of exploration also. The most important is that of Vasco da Gama, who lived between 1469 and 1525. Da Gama goes on a very long voyage of exploration, 1497, 1498, 1499. If you look in your textbook, you can see his voyage depicted for you on page 496. So, on this voyage, Da Gama retraces Diaz's steps. He goes all the way down the western coast of Africa, down to the southern tip, heads back up the eastern side, and he and his men push on. They cut across the Indian Ocean and land in Calicut, India. There they find all kinds of wonderful spices and commodities. They negotiate a trade relationship. They head back to Portugal, report to Manuel what they've found, and while these voyages may not sound like they've accomplished a lot, they certainly have. By the year 1500, Portugal controlled the flow of gold and spices and all other commodities to Europe. Back up here for a second. 1453, with the fall of Constantinople, it had been the Muslims since 1453 who were controlling the flow of gold and spices to Europe. Now it's Portugal. Tiny, insignificant, seemingly unimportant Portugal, who leads the way in the age of European expansion. Now, we may be wondering at this time, how did these explorers like Diaz and da Gama have success in these voyages? Well, they had some tools or technological advances, and you can read more about these in your textbook, that aided them on the way. Cannon, which were perfected in 1350, and by perfected we are using that word very loosely. It took about an hour to load a cannon. It took about 100 men to put in the 800-pound stone that the cannon would fire. Sometimes the cannon would burst or crack and injure those who had loaded it. There was no way to tell for sure where the 800-pound stone would go, so to say cannon were perfected in Europe in 1350 is using the word perfected very loosely. But what was discovered in the age of European expansion is that by mounting cannon on ships, some of these problems could be avoided. The big advantage is that as European explorers like Diaz de Gama and all of the other later explorers, when they mount these cannon on their ship, they have a major technological advance here, because at first they're going around Africa and up to Asia. Africans and Asians at the time do not have this advanced level of technology. Later, when they get involved in the Americas, the Native American people do not have any level of technology that can match European firepower with cannon either. Caravels, which we talked about before, are also a technological advance. The magnetic compass, which allows you to determine north and south. And the astrolabe, which is a complicated device that allowed sailors to plot their latitude. The next topic that I want to discuss with you is motives or causes. Why would men be willing, literally, to risk life and limb to go on one of these voyages that could last 2, 3, 4 years or longer? What motivated them to do so? Well, the first cause or motivating factor for European explorers is centralized governments. In this period, the centralized governments were Spain, Portugal, France, and Great Britain. By centralized government, we mean a government that was powerful, wealthy, master of all within its boundaries. In other words, there is no explorer in this period who was rich enough to undertake a voyage of this magnitude. Okay, so it was very expensive to furnish ships, to make provisions for the ships, to find sailors and pay them. All of this was extremely expensive and could not be done by any individual explorer. Governments, on the other hand, could afford these sorts of voyages. So Spain, Portugal, France, and Great Britain offered financial encouragement to men who were willing to go on these voyages. A man who was lucky enough to be the captain of one of these voyages could negotiate for himself a very lucrative contract, which would give him a portion or percentage of anything that he found, and he would bring the rest back to the country for whom he was sailing. A second motive or cause, sort of a strange sounding concept here, is land hunger in Spain. In Spain at this time, there was no land to be had. All of the land was held by old money, or people who had been rich and powerful as long as anybody could remember. That means if you're a young man with ambition and you want to move up and better yourself and your family, and you live in Spain, it's just not going to happen. Land in this time period was absolutely key and essential to wealth and power. So if you were a Spaniard of great ambition, desire, wants to do better, you would really be inspired to go on a voyage of exploration for the possibility of bettering yourself and your family. We can't forget either just the simple desire to satisfy curiosity, the desire for adventure and travel, just to get out and see what the rest of the world was like. If we were to travel back to this time period of the 15th century, we would find that there were books published all throughout Europe about what life was like in Africa or Asia. What might those people be like? What are their customs? People had a real fascination with Africa and Asia at the time because they didn't know much about it. It's sort of like today, we're fascinated with outer space. A lot of our books and movies concentrate on aliens and what would they be like. That's because we're familiar with the physical geography of our world, of our planet Earth. We know what people are like around the world, so our fascination is for outer space. the final frontier. Well, in the 15th century, people were absolutely fascinated about their own world, wanted to get out and experience it. You add to it that most people never traveled more than 25 miles from the spot where they were born. You can certainly see why going on a voyage of exploration would be desirable to some, just to escape the absolute boredom of their typical existence. Also, we need to point out another motivating cause, and those are spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, pepper, mace, and salt, all of which were used to preserve and flavor food. In Europe at the time, the diet consisted largely of meat, which was salted, and even though it was salted, because there's no refrigeration, it often would still turn rank or slightly rotten. So you would say, well, we would just throw it away. Yes, but in this time period, people were extremely poor, and all they had to eat was the meat that they had salted and tried to preserve from the season before, with a little bit of lettuce, cheese, and eggs. Their diet in Europe at the time was very bland, very boring, very routine, sometimes rotten if the preservation with salt did not work. Therefore, they needed spices to flavor up this boring food or to hide the stench or taste of the rottenness in the meat. So you wonder, wouldn't they get sick from that? Sometimes, of course, which is why they also imported ginger because of its calming properties for the stomach. Last three motives that I'll tell you about, these are commonly referred to as the 3 G's, gold, God, and glory. Many explorers claimed that they were sailing for God because that sounds really good. They'd say, I'm out to win converts for the Christian church. I want to Christianize heathens. Europeans referred to anybody who was not a Christian as a heathen. But in actuality, what they were really motivated by was desire for gold and material wealth, or for fame, recognition, or glory for their exploits. What I want to do next is talk with you about one of the most famous or infamous explorers of the period. This guy is known by multiple names: Cristoforo Colombo, Cristobal Colon, or as we know him in English, Christopher Columbus. So why does he have so many names? Well, Christopher Columbus, it might surprise you to learn, was actually born in Genoa, Italy. He was Italian. He sailed for Spain. Sometimes people get this kind of mixed up and they think, oh, he's English. His name sounds English. Christopher Columbus. That's how we translate it into English, is Christopher Columbus. Some people think, oh, he's Spanish. No, he sailed for Spain. He was actually from Genoa, Italy, and he came from very humble beginnings. He was born in 1451 to an impoverished family. He was not even allowed to finish school, though his father, who worked in the wool industry, wanted his children to go to school. He just couldn't afford it. So in his early teen years, Christopher Columbus decided to become a sailor, and he set sail and went on many voyages across the Mediterranean Sea, trading, and it inspired him, and he came up with a plan. Now, I'll remind you that at this time, Diaz has taken his voyage, and I'm not trying to confuse you. We went on to talk about Da Gama, but in between the voyages of Diaz and Da Gama, Christopher Columbus makes his famous 1492 voyage. He was actually in Portugal looking for aid, looking for the government to finance his voyage when Diaz was making his. Unfortunately, for Christopher Columbus, King John II did not like Columbus and refused actually to support him. So at that point, Christopher Columbus went around to other European countries like France and Spain. He never tried to get support within Italy because Italy was not a centralized government. It was too poor. Okay, it was just a jumble of city-states. So everywhere he went, he was shut down, basically. No one wanted to listen to Christopher Columbus, not even Ferdinand and Isabella to start with. Now, Ferdinand and Isabella were the king and queen of Spain, Isabella was a cousin of a cousin of a cousin of Christopher Columbus, and he was also friends with one of her advisors, which got him in basically to see her and later her husband Ferdinand. Ferdinand and Isabella met with Christopher Columbus and told him they were a bit too busy to think about a voyage of exploration at the time because they were busy with the Inquisition, which was an effort, you'll remember from Western Civ 1, to make all of Spain Catholic, basically by killing Jews and Muslims and anybody who wasn't Catholic. So they told Columbus, yeah, we're interested. Portugal is doing this, funding voyages. We're interested, but just not right now. All of our time and resources are going into the Inquisition. When we're done and satisfied, more or less, that we've killed enough people in Spain and we've made the country Catholic, then we'll listen to you. Well, Christopher Columbus was by this point married, had sons, and had lost his wife. He was a widower. So he settled in Spain and waited around for his chance with Ferdinand and Isabella. He was known while living in Spain as Cristobal Colon. His birth name was Cristoforo Colombo. We know him as Christopher Columbus. So Cristobal Colon is hanging around waiting for his chance with Ferdinand and Isabella. It finally came. He had an audience or meeting with the king and queen, and he presented to them his plan. And his plan is brilliant. It's not his fault that it rests on misinformation. What Christopher Columbus said that he wanted to do was, rather than going around Africa, which if you look at the map in your textbook, Africa is huge. It's a continent. It's like 4 times the size of the United States of America. It's gargantuan. He says, instead of going around Africa, which is time-consuming, why don't I sail west to get east? This is his plan. Go west to get east. Yes, you can do that. You can sail west and end up east, or sail east and end up west, because the earth is round. Everyone in Columbus's time knew the world was round. If you've been taught differently, that's misinformation. It's not correct. Everyone knew that the earth was round. What they didn't know was how big it was. The Vikings have been forgotten about by this time. Knowledge of the Americas no longer exists. So Christopher Columbus and other Europeans don't know about the existence of the Americas. They think Europe is separated from Asia by a small body of water. So he says, I'm going to sail directly west from Europe across this short body of water, come out on the other side of the world in Asia, and trade there. Ferdinand and Isabella think it's a great idea. They give him 3 ships, which you probably remember from elementary school, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And he departs 10/12/1492, October 12th, 1492. He's at sea for about 30 days. His men get restless. They threaten mutiny. They beg to turn around and go back to Spain. They don't understand what's taking so long. Columbus makes a deal with them. If I don't see land on the end of 3 days now, I will turn around and go back. It's one of those miraculous things that happens in history. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, he spotted land. There was no way for him to know that when he made that promise to his men. It was just luck. Where he landed was somewhere in the Bahamas in mid-November 1492. And it's hard to say where he was actually. We don't know where exactly in the Bahamas because there are almost 1,000 different islands in the Bahamas. So that information has been lost to us. But when he arrived in the Bahamas with his men, Christopher Columbus stepped off the ship with his biographer, noted the surroundings, said it was beautiful, that it must be some island off the coast of India or the mainland of Asia. They heard a rustling in the trees and bushes as native people came out to greet them. These would be Native Americans, but they were a particular group called the Taínos, inhabitants of the Bahamas. They came out bare-breasted with loincloths, with mothers suckling babies at their breasts, some with pieces of gold jewelry on, and Christopher Columbus's reaction to them was that these people were shy and timid and clearly savages because they were not wearing clothing. He communicated with them best he could. There's a major language barrier here. He doesn't speak Taínos. They don't speak Spanish or Italian. So they do the best they can, grunting, gesticulating, pointing. He asked them where they got the gold. Could they show him where they found this gold? And the Taínos inhabitants are amazed by the Europeans. They've never seen boats like this. The most they've ever seen is a dugout canoe. They've never seen a huge ship. They've never seen white people before. The only thing I can really equate it to would be like if we had contact with an alien spaceship. That would be about the same sort of response that the Taínos people had to Columbus and his guys. They were curious, but deathly afraid of them at the same time. Columbus claimed, though some of his men said otherwise, that some of these Taínos people were willing to go with him. Some say he kidnapped some Taínos people and used them as guides. He headed a little bit farther south, actually, and ended up in Cuba, which he swore was China, even though it didn't look like China was supposed to look. And see, Europe had been trading with China and Asia for 1,000 years plus since Roman times. They knew what China was supposed to look like, what its temples looked like, what its bazaars and spice markets looked like, what its people looked like. And some of his guys said, "Come on, Chris, surely you've got to know this is not China." He swore it was, made them swear. If they refused, he said he would cut their tongue out. So they all agreed that they were in China or somewhere close. It is important to point out that every person that Christopher Columbus encountered in Cuba or in the Bahamas on that first landing, he called them Indians because he thought he was off the coast of India or Asia, and that term has stuck until modern times as a description for Native American people. Well, Christopher Columbus did some preliminary scouting around Cuba and in the Caribbean before heading back to Ferdinand and Isabella with some of the Taínos people. He brought those people, Taínos people, to Ferdinand and Isabella, asked if he could go back to those islands that he had just visited, bring more of these people, and enslave them. Ferdinand and Isabella disagreed. "No, we think you should Christianize them instead, but since you have these, go ahead and sell them." So Christopher Columbus sold these Taínos he brought with him. Ferdinand and Isabella added some more money, some more sailors. Columbus went back for a second voyage. In the course of his life, Christopher Columbus made 4 total voyages to the Americas. All the while he was looking for the mainland of Asia. He ended up discovering, if you want to use that word, every single island in the Caribbean Sea, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica. He visited them all, discovered them all, left behind Spaniards to make colonies on these islands. When he could, he appointed members of his Italian family as the governors of these areas. He skirted down the whole of Central America, naming the places as he went, from Mexico all the way down to Panama. When he got to Panama, Christopher Columbus was already eaten up with tropical diseases, very sick and in poor health. When natives communicated to him, he and his men were now picking up some of the similarities between native languages, and they were becoming fluent in some of them, or at least had the ability to communicate. These people in Panama told him that if he was willing to take a couple of days' journey across land, he would see big water. The big water they were referring to is what basically was the Pacific Ocean, which would be discovered later by Magellan, or named by Magellan. So Columbus, no, he's not interested. He's still looking for spice markets and bazaars and gold. So he gets back on the boat, lands in Venezuela. He and his men were driven back on their ships in Venezuela by, as he called it, a horde of hostile monkeys who attacked him and his men with fruit. Christopher Columbus said that Venezuela was the most beautiful place he had been. He said it was the Garden of Eden, and by that he meant literally Garden of Eden, that was where it all began. By this point, he's delirious from tropical fevers. When he ends up back in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella and many others questioned Christopher Columbus. Are you sure that this isn't someplace else? Because what you describe sounds like nothing what we know about Asia. He maintained until he died in 1506 that he had been somewhere off the coast of Asia. He did not want to admit failure, which in a way is kind of silly to me, because if he didn't want to admit he was wrong. I guess, pride got in the way, but if he had admitted that he was wrong, what he actually did was even greater than finding Asia. He found a whole new world, but he refused to believe that. One of the first people to step out and challenge Christopher Columbus on his discoveries was a fellow Italian contemporary, Amerigo Vespucci, who lived from 1451 to 1512. Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian, said publicly, Christopher Columbus, based on what I have read in his diaries and his logs, has been to, quote, Mundus Nuova. Now, that translates as New World. Amerigo Vespucci coins that phrase. Amerigo Vespucci goes so far as to actually retrace the voyages of Christopher Columbus, returned to Europe and said, I am convinced now that it is Mundus Nuova. So map makers said, okay, great, Amerigo Vespucci, this place that you have been, we will name for you. We will call it the Americas. Why not the Amerigos? Well, that's because Europe, Asia, and Africa are feminine words. Amerigo is a masculine name. America is the feminine form. So the New World was called the Americas, North, Central, and South America. We did not name these areas for Christopher Columbus. Had we would be living in the Columbias, North, Central, and South Columbia. We did not. They're named for Amerigo Vespucci. I want to tell you for just a moment about some later explorers. Magellan, Portuguese, I know it doesn't sound like it, but he is a Portuguese explorer, sails for Spain, though, because he got a better deal. From 1519 to 1521, Ferdinand Magellan is on a voyage of circumnavigation. What that means is he's attempting to sail around the earth to prove that you can sail west to get east or east to get west, that the earth is round, and to actually see how big around it was. So again, if you refer to your map within chapter 15, what you'll see is Magellan's voyage depicted there for you. Magellan, unlike Christopher Columbus, headed more south than west. Going south, it took him down the Atlantic Ocean, down the eastern coast of South America. It is important to know that when Magellan left Europe, he left with 250 men on board. When Magellan and his men got to the bottom of South America, they started having some serious problems. They were freezing to death. They were starving. And I know some of you are thinking, what is she talking about, freezing to death in South America? It's all tropical and hot and wet. Yes, parts of it are. But if you look at the map in your textbook, notice the proximity between Antarctica, or the South Pole, and the tip of South America. There are glaciers and penguins in South America at its tip. So Magellan and his men were struggling really hard when they got to the tip of South America. Fortunately, there was a little opening there, a strait, a naturally occurring opening. Magellan sailed through it. It's named for him, the Strait of Magellan to this day, and he heads back up into the warmer waters of the Pacific Ocean, which he named the Pacific Ocean for how calm it was. Now, in the course of going through South America, Magellan and his men had been forced to eat whatever they could find. They were running out of provisions very quickly. I've had students ask me, why didn't they eat each other? Well, that's kind of gross. That's cannibalism. Why didn't they fish? Why didn't they capture penguins? I can't answer those questions. I don't know. They've never said why they didn't. All I can tell you is that they ate rats when their food ran out. They ate the rats they found on the ship. When the rats ran out, they ate sawdust that they found on the ship. just because they were hungry. It had no nutritional value whatsoever. Then they started to eat their clothing. Fortunately, they got into the warmer waters of the Pacific, were able to fish, etc., etc. They kept sailing. If you're looking at your map, you don't have to worry that they fall off there on the edge because the world is round. They come out on the other side of the Pacific Ocean in Asia. They stop in the Philippines, where they get involved in a skirmish between native rival groups there in the Philippines. And in the process, Magellan is killed. He's killed in a war between warring groups in the Philippines. He dies in 1521. So the thing to point out here is that Magellan is given credit for circumnavigation of the globe, but he didn't actually do it. It was one of his subordinates, a guy named Elcano, don't worry about that, who completed the voyage. But Magellan, because it was his undertaking and he was the highest ranking individual on the ship, has been given credit for circumnavigation of the globe, meaning he sailed around it. Not exactly. His men continued from the Philippines back to Europe. When they arrived, 18 out of 250 men were left. If this doesn't show you how difficult voyages of exploration were in this period, nothing will. Sailors had to deal with all sorts of deprivation, food spoilage, shortage of food, vitamin deficiencies that were life-threatening, including scurvy. It was a big, really frightening undertaking to go on one of these voyages. Last two explorers I'm going to talk with you about are the conquistadors of Spain, Cortez and Pizarro. Cortez' major claim to fame, and his name can be spelled with a Z or an S, was that he left from Spain due to land hunger in that country. He was ambitious, he wanted more. He obtained a job in the colony of Spain on Cuba. And while he was there, he heard rumors about this vast Indian civilization of the Aztecs in Mexico, which Christopher Columbus and his men had seen but had not bothered to, venture into at all. So he says, okay, this sounds like something I want to get involved with. So he did not have official permission to do so. He's got to be glad that it turned out well, because if it hadn't, he would have ended up in jail for the rest of his life. But he snuck around and got 600 guys from Cuba, Spaniards, who were willing to go war with the Aztecs with him, 17 horses, and 10 cannon. And he took off without the authority to do so, with this manpower, weaponry, and horses, basically stealing all of it from Spain. And he went to Mexico. When he arrived in Mexico in 1519, he found the Aztec civilization, which some say numbered as many as 25 million people, 600 Spaniards, 17 horses, 10 cannon, to do battle with 25 million people. What Cortez said when he stepped off his ship in Tenochtitlan, or modern-day Mexico City, he told his biographer, hey, write this down. He said, I've come to win gold, not work the fields like a common man. In other words, he was there to win gold from the Aztecs. He was there for wealth. Well, a quick glance around the city, a quick how do you do with some of the Aztecs. He looked around and kind of more or less took in the scene, and he was impressed by how advanced the Aztecs were at the time. Their city of Mexico City was founded on an island with causeways that connected it to the mainland, and that was much like Venice, Italy. That's what it reminded him of. He was amazed by all of the shops, barber shops, pharmacies. They even had something like a Lowe's or Home Depot in Mexico City, where you could go and buy homewares, building blocks for your house. So he was impressed, wow, these Aztecs have all this great stuff. And then he was horrified when he found out that the Aztecs practiced human sacrifice and cannibalism. He witnessed this firsthand. He said on one occasion several thousand Native Americans, or as they called them, Indians, several thousand Indians from a neighboring tribe that the Aztecs called enemies had been captured, and their virgins were offered as human sacrifices, their hearts pulled out while they were still alive at the top of a pyramid in Mexico City, and then the bodies were thrown down while the person was still alive. Yes, you can live without your heart for a little bit. So they threw them while they were still alive down the pyramid. When they fell at the bottom, the Aztecs would descend on these cadavers and they would eat them. So they were practicing human sacrifice and cannibalism. And Cortez saw this rack where they kept the skulls of these sacrifices, and there were 100,000 skulls on this one rack. And he said, okay, note to the biographer, change that. I'm here to Christianize the Aztecs. Now, I'm going to tell you, I think his motives were a combination of Christianizing, but he was still out for gold too. Ultimately, Cortez does battle with the Aztecs and their king, their leader, Montezuma, who first was willing to work with Cortez, saw him as a god on earth, and gave in to all of his demands for gold and turquoise and valuables, and then thought, maybe this guy's not a god, because European diseases were brought with Cortez: smallpox, measles, mumps, and the Aztecs were dying in huge numbers, and Montezuma felt it was his responsibility to drive these people away. So he and the Aztecs tried to fight against Cortez, but the Aztecs have pathetic, inferior weaponry. They had little stabbing spears, leather armor to go against cannon and metal armor of the Spaniards, not to mention that the Spaniards had horses, which did not exist anywhere in the Americas. The Aztecs were deathly afraid of horses. When Cortez and his men would march into battle against the Aztecs, it was a murderous rampage. The Aztecs did not have sufficient equipment to fight Cortez. Add to this, disease was spreading, so Cortez and his men would often go into battle, a planned battle, against the Aztecs, and find the Aztecs too sick to fight. Long story short, by 1521, Cortez had subjugated all of Mexico, called it New Spain, or Mexico, and handed it over to Spain. And of course, Cortez got himself one heck of a lucrative contract for having done that, and he was rich. In the 1530s, a conquistador by the name of Pizarro took over the Incan Empire of Peru. Much like Cortez's exploits against the Aztecs in Mexico, Pizarro used his advanced weaponry and also, of course, disease helped him wipe out the Incas of Peru, and he added Peru over to the Spanish holdings. Last couple of topics here: colonial administration and results. How did the countries of Europe view their colonies? Okay, well, let's start here first by reminding you that first in the Americas were the Native Americans at about 13,000 BC. Next, Vikings, 900 to 1,000. Next, Christopher Columbus, 1492. So the first country to get involved in the Americas was Spain, and if you look in your textbook on the same map that we've been referring to, you see that it's conveniently color-coded for you, and it shows you Spanish and Portuguese territories in the Americas. The Spanish got involved beginning in 1492 in the New World. They took over the coastlines of South America, with the exception of Brazil, which went to Portugal. All of what was the southern and western part of what becomes the United States of America, and the whole of Central America, from Mexico to Panama. Portugal had Brazil. Spain and Portugal believed it was wrong to enslave the native peoples of these areas. They didn't like to call it slavery, so they came up with a different word for it: encomienda. And that's one of the items that's actually on your study guide there. And basically what they did was they told settlers to the New World that they could have however many native people they wanted, and they could work them however hard they felt. They just could not enslave them. That's exactly the same thing as enslaving them, okay? France did not get involved in the Americas until the 1530s, and their voyages took them to the extreme north. So in the 1530s, France began to colonize what we think of as Canada. Great Britain does not get involved in the Americas until the late 1580s. They tried to make a colony at a place they called Roanoke, Virginia. It failed. We don't know why. It disappeared. It's called a lost colony. Their first permanent settlement was in Jamestown, Virginia at 1607. So starting in the 1600s, the English come in waves, including the Pilgrims on the Mayflower to Plymouth Rock in 1620. Okay, so what the British hoped to do was to transplant law and order from England to their new colonies in North America and leave behind the religious persecution that was going on in England at the time. What these English settlers hoped to do in their colonies, or transplantations they called them, which eventually would be 13 in total, that stretched all the way down the Atlantic seaboard, south all the way to Georgia. What they wanted to do was to remain isolated from Native American populations, have no dealings with them whatsoever. That didn't work out. If you're familiar with the early years of American history, there's a great deal of sharing and cooperation between Native Americans and English settlers. The English settlers probably would have starved to death had it not been for Native Americans showing them how to grow crops, how to eat, how to understand to work the land in North America. There's also a great deal of warfare and lack of tolerance on both sides. Native Americans raiding English villages, the English raiding Native American villages, warfare on both sides. So overall then, what are the results of the age of European exploration and expansion? Well, first of all, an economic boom for Europe. It's estimated that 35 million pounds of silver and 1 million pounds of gold were taken out of the Americas, specifically Central and South American mines, and brought into the economy of Europe. Well, at first, bringing in gold and silver meant great wealth for Europe, but they continued to bring in more and more gold and silver into circulation in the European economy, and that led to inflation. When you have a lot of money in circulation, it devalues it. So basically, Europe goes from being very wealthy because of the Americas into inflation, and then when the mines dry up in Central and South America, to economic depression. Europe was on an economic roller coaster ride because of its expansion into the Americas. Also, this period resulted in what we call the Columbian Exchange, or cultural and biological exchange between the Old and New World. In other words, both the Old World and the New World borrowed and exchanged things with each other. To be real specific here, the New World of the Americas gave to the Old World all kinds of wonderful things to eat. Remember, we said Europe primarily had meat and no vegetables. Well, they get from the New World things like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, bell peppers, chili peppers, chocolate, vanilla, lima beans, pole beans, navy beans, kidney beans, avocados, peanuts, pecans, cashews, pineapples, blueberries, sunflowers to eat, all kinds of wonderful forms of wild rice, and also tobacco. Columbus was the first person to see the smoking of tobacco, and he thought it was pretty interesting, so he took some back to Europe, and Europe got hooked on tobacco. So the New World gave Europe wonderful things to eat, but in a negative vein here, the New World also gave to the Old World some diseases, like malaria and yellow fever, a venereal form of syphilis, which is an STD, Europe had syphilis before its contact with the Americas, but it was not a sexually transmitted form. They also get from the New World influenza, or the flu. So what does the Old World give to the New World? Well, the New World had loads of vegetables to eat, but no real meat. So to the New World, Europe gave cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens. None of these things were here in the Americas before contact with the Old World. They also gave to the New World weeds like rattlesnake grass, crabgrass, dandelions. All of that was brought from Europe in seed and in the excrement of the cattle, the pigs, the sheep, the chickens, okay, all of that. All of those animals had feed that was brought with them that had weeds in it, but also when these animals relieved themselves, their excrement contained seeds for these weeds, and the weeds became windborne and spread throughout the Americas. So many people have said that the Americas was a perfect, pristine sort of environment before contact with the Old World. Also, Europe gave to the New World roaches and disease. It's an equal transfer of disease here. The Old World of Europe gives to the New World smallpox, mumps, measles, and an STD called gonorrhea. These diseases were unknown in the Americas and had a devastating impact on Native American populations. Some have estimated that half of all of the Native Americans in the Americas died in this period as a result of European disease. A good example of this is that in 1492, when Columbus on his first voyage went to Hispaniola, the population he estimated was 100,000. In 1570, there were just 300 native people on that island, and that's from exposure to European disease. The Old World of Europe also gave to the New World Roman Catholicism in Central and South America and in Canada. France was a Roman Catholic country. The English brought with them Protestantism to their 13 colonies. Language was brought here from Europe, so that to this day the dominant language of Central and South America is Spanish, except for Brazil, which speaks Portuguese. English is spoken in what became the United States of America because we began as English colonies. French is spoken in Canada. France eventually lost Canada in war to England, so in Canada you also find English spoken. The last thing I want to tell you here about an exchange between the two was literally an exchange of DNA. The Old World and New World literally came together in this period to form a new race of people. European settlers who came here intermarried and intermixed with Native American people and created a new race of people called mestizos, who are of mixed European and Native American ancestry. To this very day, in Central and South America, the majority of the people are mestizos. Last couple of results of this period: international rivalry and war. European countries became jealous of each other, wanting to battle each other for more territory, more holdings in the Americas, jealous of what other countries had. So they used the wealth that they were importing from the Americas to fight each other in international wars for control of more territory in the Americas. Also, certainly we have to point out that the most obvious result is colonization of the Americas by Europe. And as Native Americans began to die off in Central and South America, the Portuguese and Spanish could no longer, quote-unquote, enslave them, though they weren't supposed to be doing that anyway. They needed an alternative labor force. A Spanish missionary by the name of Bartolomé de las Casas recommended the importation of Africans to Central and South America to take the place of the dying Native American population. European nations agreed, and in the 1500s we have the start of the slave trade, from Africa to the Americas. That ends our look at Chapter 15, European Exploration and Conquest.